there are two different sides to our fiscal policy discussion. There's a tax side and a spending side. We spoke a little bit yesterday we spent a bit of time yesterday speaking about the tax side, kind of discussed the government's budgets in terms of the South African context and issues that are currently being brought up in the political discourse about what government should be doing with its money. We spoke a little bit about whether it can get more money through this budget process, and there's definitely limited scope as we currently sit. So any national discourse that talks about how this budget should be rearranged has got very limited scope for making very many changes. We saw that when you have taxes, in all our previous chapters we'd spoken about the demand side effect of taxes, but now we see that there's also in fact a supply side effect of taxes. And the supply side effect corresponds to what you've spoken about in microeconomics previously. So when you add a tax to something, it shifts the supply to the left. Okay? Assuming that, of course, the tax is imposed on the supply side. If you impose a tax on the demand side, then it can shift the demand curve. But in microeconomics, we saw that if we impose the tax on the supply side, then it shifts the supply curve to the left. That has negative consequences for our output and for our GDP growth. So this is where we stopped just discussing the idea of the Laffer curve, which suggests that you can increase tax revenue by increasing the tax rate, but you can only do that up to a certain point, above which you actually get less revenue by increasing the tax rate because you're decreasing output by a greater proportion than what you're increasing your tax rate by. So this is the kind of balancing act you have to play. In terms of the South African economy, there are those that argue we're sort of near the top here, and there are those that argue we are not near the top. But if you look certainly in terms of international norms, our tax rate is not low, put it that way. Places that have higher tax rates tend to be places like Norway or Sweden, right? Now, although you have much higher tax rates there, you get, for example, free schooling, you get free medical care, you get you get pensions, right? You get free maternity contributions, right? Your maternity leave is anything up to a year, okay? So you have high tax rates, but you get a lot of benefits. So while our tax rates might not be as high as some of the highest places in the world, in the South African context, for example, if you earn above a certain amount and it's not that much, well, you don't qualify, for example, for free medical hospital stuff. Even the government, you can get free medical care from government hospitals. That's only subject to you earning, and I think it's less than something like 5,000 Rand a month or something, right? You can get free schooling, but again, only if you earn less than whatever it is. I don't know the exact amounts, but again, it's around 5,000 Rand a month. Okay. Social grants, you can only get those if you're earning basically nothing. Pensions, government doesn't give pensions unless, again, you are essentially destitute, right? So whilst we might not have the highest tax rates in the world, when you consider the fact that compared to countries that do have very high tax rates, you get a lot of services for free that we otherwise have to pay for. If you added those payments onto what we currently get taxed, essentially we have one of the highest tax rates in the world. Okay? Or put it this way, the amount that you'd be spending would be much higher than what you are paying in taxes in the countries where you get the highest tax rates. So are we at this top? well, we're not in terms of some countries, but those countries offer a lot more for that tax, right? Which means there's very limited scope in terms of increasing the tax rate and still having people spend money on things that can grow the economy. Because you increase the tax rate, they've still got to pay for things like medical care and schooling. Okay, so that's definitely an interesting place to focus on if you are interested in the South African demographics and South African economic issues and how to solve various social ills. You know, what does our tax look like, and is there any scope for changing that? It's an interesting question. Righty-ho. Otherwise, back to what we've normally or just generally spoken about when we talk about the government and the government's role in the economy. It's usually has to do with fiscal stimulus. In other words, increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. So fiscal stimulus means, comes from the word stimulate, so it's to use fiscal policy to increase production and employment. Okay? And there are two different ways in which this can happen. There's automatic fiscal policy, and then there is discretionary fiscal policy. In other words, fiscal policy that is not automatic. This is fiscal policy that is basically determined by actual decisions that get made by people that basically doesn't happen automatically. So exactly, discretionary fiscal policy initiated by an act of parliament, whereas automatic fiscal policy triggered by a state of the economy. In other words, there's no actual action that the government enacts. So automatic fiscal policy and cyclical and structural budget balances. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about what we mean by automatic versus discretionary. Automatic, we'll look at this diagram here. Our structural, the same diagram but with a slightly different emphasis on what we're talking about, okay? So there's two items, the government budget, which change automatically in response to the state of the economy. There are automatic changes in tax revenues, and there may be automatic changes in spending, okay? How does tax revenue change automatically? Well, remember, if tax revenue, revenue is T times Y, okay? Without changing the tax rate, if Y changes, if Y increases, what's going to happen to revenue? It's going to increase, right? So without government making any kind of discretionary decisions about how T should change, if output increases, government naturally gets more revenue. Alternatively, if output decreases, what happens to government revenue? Decreases, okay? So when real GDP decreases in a recession, wages and profits fall, but so does tax revenue. What about spending? When the economy expands, unemployment falls, the number of people experiencing economic hardships decrease, so this says needs testing spending decreases. In other words, needs tested spending is things like social grants. Okay? So what happens as output increases? As output increases, unemployment decreases. If unemployment decreases, what does that mean about government's social grants? It doesn't need to give social grants to these people that were unemployed and are now employed, right? So government spending on things like unemployment benefits decreases when output increases. Yeah? Okay. Alternatively, when an economy is in a recession, unemployment is high and the number of people experiencing economic hardship increases, so needs tested spending increases. Okay? So what that means is we can plot essentially tax revenues and spending. So we'll just, spending we normally just call G, and tax revenue we can call that T. Okay. So our revenues, government spending, and our taxes, T. Taxes, okay, expenditure versus real GDP, right? Sorry, what am I talking about? I just got those wrong. Revenues, taxes, outlays, government spending. So government spending on things like, remember, government spending on things like social grants is going to decrease as output increases, right? So we've got a negative relationship between government spending and output. Alternatively, what about taxes? As output increases, tax revenues increase, so we have a positive relationship. Morning, hello. No, sorry, I'm afraid we're in the middle of a lecture. Thank you. Right, so as the revenues go up, as GDP goes up, revenues go up. As GDP goes up, outlays go down. So what's interesting here is a change in GDP can lead to either a deficit or a surplus, even though government does not make any changes to its fiscal policy, right? It makes no discretionary changes, but the budget balance changes. And we refer to that as an automatic fiscal policy. Okay? So as GDP changes, revenues and outlays change automatically without any discretionary intervention by the government. The way that we normally talk about government spending, when we have our y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, we usually only consider c to be a function of y, and g is exogenous, right? Okay? Obviously, in this diagram, our g is not exogenous. You get what I'm saying? Taxes, we usually assume if we've got lump sum taxes, okay, so depending on our consumption function, if we've got lump sum taxes, then those lump sum taxes are exogenous. If we have a tax rate, then the tax rate is obviously endogenous. So the revenues here would correspond to a tax rate, and the outlays here, which is downward sloping, would correspond to not an exogenous government spending, but an endogenous government spending function. Okay? If we were to plot this instead in terms of our usual equation, what we would assume is just that government spending, G, was just a horizontal line, right? In other words, independent of real GDP. Are you with me? That's just how we normally write our equation, as if G is just a horizontal line, right? And if we had like a tax rate, so let's, if our taxes were in terms of a tax rate, okay, then we would have an upward sloping tax revenue curve, right? Even with a horizontal government spending and a upward sloping tax revenue, we would still have the same thing. As GDP increases, we can still end up with a budget surplus, right? As GDP decreases, we can still end up with a budget, with a budget deficit. Everyone with me? With me? Okay. What are you lost on? The cyclical deficit. Okay. So I said even if government spending is horizontal, if taxes are increasing as output is increasing, right? Then if output decreases, tax revenues fall, but government spending stays constant, right? So as GDP falls, revenues fall, government spending stays constant, you can see tax revenues are less than government spending. Government budget's going to be in deficit, right? Alternatively, if GDP is increasing, with government spending staying constant, tax revenues increase, we move into a surplus where tax revenue is above government spending. So we've got a surplus. Okay. So these are changes in our government budget despite the fact that government is making no discretionary decisions about fiscal policy. So because government revenues fall and expenditure increases in a recession, the budget provides automatic stimulus that helps to shrink the recessionary gap. Okay? In other words, as output decreases, we enter into a recession. Okay? We enter into a recession as output decreases. What is a way in which government can stimulate output? By either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, right? Let's just assume our government spending is constant, so that just sticks to the same story we've had before. We enter into a recession, output decreases, and as a result of output decreasing, taxes naturally fall. As taxes fall, what does that do to aggregate demand? Shifts aggregate demand to the right. So that would be a natural counteraction to a recession, right? We enter into a recession and naturally taxes decrease, which increases aggregate demand, right? So you can see it's an automatic stimulation of the economy, right? Automatic stimulus. So in terms of our diagram here, if our output at 4 is our potential GDP, okay, so this is full employment. Our government spending currently, if we are at potential, our government spending will equal our government revenues, okay? So at full employment, what will our budget balance be? Will it be a deficit? Would it be a surplus, or would it be what we call a balanced budget? A balanced budget is when revenues equal tax outlays. Sorry, tax revenues equal government outlays. So, it's a balanced budget, right? Okay. So here we would have a balanced budget if we were at potential. If, however, we entered into a recession, the budget would become a deficit. If we entered into an inflationary gap, right? In other words, we started expanding above potential, we would end up with a surplus. And again, that surplus has the effect of decreasing aggregate demand, right? So it naturally counteracts whatever's happening in the economy. So then you can have a cyclical and a structural budget balance. A structural surplus or deficit, which is the budget balance which would occur if the economy were at full employment, okay? So in this example here, if we're at full employment, okay, we have a balanced budget. Therefore, we do not have a structural surplus or a structural deficit. What would a structural deficit or a structural surplus look like? Well, if we looked at the same diagram, so we're just going to plot the same diagram. So output against either tax revenue or government spending. Okay. Let's just use a horizontal government spending and increasing taxes. Okay. If this is potential GDP, so in other words, potential GDP means we're at the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, that's the level of output for our long run aggregate supply curve if we were plotting prices. Okay, so long run aggregate supply curve, potential GDP. Okay. So at potential GDP, if our government spending and our tax revenue are equal, we have, so let's call this point A, balanced budget. What if our potential GDP, however, was not here, but rather here. Okay, so here was potential GDP 1, potential GDP 2. What happens if our potential GDP is only at 0.2? We'll call that Y1 and call this Y2. So at output level Y2, our potential GDP, what is our budget balance in this case? It's deficit. In other words, our tax revenues are less than our government spending, right? So we'll call this situation B. Situation B is what we would call a structural deficit. In other words, we have a deficit even when we are at potential GDP. Okay? That's what the structural deficit aspect of it is. A structural deficit so differs to a cyclical deficit or a cyclical surplus. So what is a cyclical surplus or a cyclical deficit? That is the actual surplus or deficit minus the structural surplus or deficit. Okay? In other words, if this is our potential level of GDP, okay? So we're at Y2, that's our potential. Are you happy we have a structural deficit? Yeah? What happens now if our actual GDP is Y3? Okay? At Y3, are you happy that we have a bigger deficit than at Y2? Yes? Now that bigger deficit has two components. It has a structural component and it has a cyclical component. In other words, this is the extra deficit because we are away from potential GDP. Does that make sense? So this portion would be the structural deficit, and this tiny little portion over here, this addition, would be the cyclical deficit. Okay? You happy with that? In other words, if we return to our previous diagram, in this first graph at our point of intersection, we had a balanced budget, correct? If there was a recession, we would move into a deficit, and the entire deficit here would be a cyclical deficit. Why? Because we have no structural deficit. So everything here is a cyclical deficit. Versus in our diagram here, where our deficit has two components, a cyclical deficit component and a structural deficit component. So just some terminology. Yeah.
So then how does the government resolve this matter of structural deficit?
How does it resolve? When you say resolve, do you mean how would the government run its budget so that it didn't have a structural deficit? Is that what you mean? Okay, well, in our example here, where we're dealing with Y2, okay, so at potential GDP Y2, the government has a structural deficit. The way it could deal with that structural deficit would be to, instead of having government spending at this level here, let's call it, in fact, let's do this, instead of having government spending level G1, what it would need to do is decrease its spending to government spending level G2. If it reduced its spending at potential GDP, it would have no structural deficit. Right? Then, if actual GDP was below potential, for whatever reason, right, we were in some recession, what would we end up with? Just a cyclical deficit, just this little component here. Cool.
It will decrease this spending by stopping supply just
I mean, Yeah, so how would it decrease that? You mean in the South African context specifically? Yeah, it would have to, in fact, it doesn't have to. If we look at, it doesn't have to be from social grants, right? If you look at the government spending, what does the government spend most money on? The salaries of civil servants. That's where most of its money goes. Okay?
It will decrease the salaries.
It would be one way of doing it, absolutely. But it's almost impossible to decrease the salaries of civil servants. What you would, yeah, it's a very tricky situation. In the South African context, especially because the civil servants have quite a good, well-organized union. And they would make it very difficult for those payments to go down. Remember also that if you are a civil servant, you are an employee of the government, which means your salary depends on the government, right? Which means it depends. So our government is run by the ANC, which means your salary essentially is determined by ANC policy in a sense. In other words, for government to decrease your salary, it would have to be ANC sanctioned, if that makes sense, right? So if you are a government employee relying on a salary from government, you are also probably an ANC supporter. So it's politically very difficult to decrease the salaries of civil servants if they are also your voter base, right? So yeah, there is a reason that we spend so little on things like infrastructure, because infrastructure doesn't argue, right? Your civil servants will argue, and they are your voter base, more than likely, right? Transfers and subsidies are going to destitute, and they are probably also your voter base, so you don't want to take that stuff away from them. So you're unlikely to change these two things. The other way that you can do it, the other way we can do it is to keep government spending where it is at G1 and shift the tax curve up. Try and get this tax curve to go. Okay? Again, as we've seen in the South African context, question is how much can we shift that tax curve up? Right? How do we increase it? One way that we did it recently was this, was here. So this was Praveen Gordhan when he was in charge of SARS. What they did was they just made sure that they followed up on people submitting tax returns. So they just made sure that people paid the taxes they were meant to pay. Right? They chased them up and they made sure that people paid taxes. Okay? So Gordhan's concern at the moment with Moyani is that he's losing grip on that. Which then means that if you're not as efficient at collecting your taxes, your tax revenues actually fall. Okay? So even without increasing the tax rate, you could potentially increase tax revenues. But Gordhan did a very good job of that, and I think it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to increase the efficiency of tax. So what you'd have to do is increase the tax rate, right? And then we end up with this situation here. Can we increase the tax rates? I'm not sure. Yeah?
Finance Minister, would the work base, like the employees that worked for him,
Yeah.
change as well?
No, so he's in charge of the organization, but the people that are employed in the organization are employed regardless of who's in charge.
So surely if they'd be good at collecting tax revenue before, they would still continue, or unless the goals change, I guess.
So what's happened, so first of all, the finance minister doesn't collect the revenues, SARS collects the revenues, right? So the person who's in charge also has other people who are managers. And the people that work for the managers, you've got to have like a skills base in order to know what you need to do. So if the man at the top changes and then those that are underneath don't want to work with that man and they change, and he brings in people that don't have the requisite skills, then the whole efficiency of the system, yes, exactly. And then also remember, if your organization has a focus on collecting tax revenue, that's fine, but if your organization changes its focus to, instead of collecting revenues efficiently, for example, it's targeting political opponents through the tax system, then you divert resources away from revenue collection to political score settling, right? And then that means that you stop revenue coming in from where it would otherwise be coming in from. Yeah. So that's what you refer to when you say state capture. When the organs of state are captured for the purpose other than what they're supposed to do, they start doing other things, right? So like when the Hawks start prosecuting people not on the basis of what their mandate is. So the Hawks have a certain mandate of the kinds of crimes they're supposed to investigate, and then they start investigating other kinds of crimes, right? Then you say, well, why? That's not the mandate of the Hawks. Then you talk about capture again. Okay. Yeah, so we have automatic stimulus as well as any kind of discretionary changes, like what you asked, right? So a shift in government spending down or an increase in this tax curve up, those would be discretionary actions, right? So let's just put that there. Those would be discretionary fiscal policy actions. Am I spelling discretionary right? Is it an S or a T? I can't remember. It's a T. Discretionary. Okay. Okay. Discretionary fiscal stimulus, and aggregate demand. There are two main fiscal policy multipliers, the government expenditure multiplier and the tax multiplier. What do we mean by these? Well, we've seen them previously in our equations, but we can just deal with them quickly. Our output in equilibrium can be written as a function of the multiplier, right? Y equal to the multiplier times all our autonomous components, A plus I plus G minus BT plus X minus M. So then we're assuming all of these things are autonomous, right? Endogenous, okay? I mean, not endogenous, exogenous. So what then is the government spending multiplier? The government spending multiplier would be the following. How does output change when government spending changes? What is the government spending multiplier? 1 over 1 minus B. Yep. So this is the government's spending multiplier. What about the tax multiplier? Well, how does output change if we change lump sum taxes? Are you with me on that? The tax multiplier would be minus B over 1 minus B. In other words, here's our coefficient, minus B times 1 over 1 minus B equals minus B over 1 minus B. Yeah? So here's an interesting idea. What happens if we change both government spending and we change taxes? And we change government spending and taxes by the same amount. Sorry, that's supposed to be a plus. Okay? So if we change government spending and we change taxes, we're going to have some change in output. Yeah? if we change government spending by, say, 100 Rand, and we change taxes by 100 Rand, what will the change in output be? So you think it's going to increase by 100? You agree with that? Anyone disagree with that? Still got 200. Okay? Let's work it out. We've got 1 over 1 minus b times 100 plus minus b over 1 minus b times 100. So we've got a common factor. So we've got 1 plus minus b over 1 minus b times 100, which is the same as 1 minus b over 1 minus b, which is 1 times 100, which equals okay. So this is interesting because what it suggests is, let's say we start at a balanced budget, right? The government's budget is balanced, tax revenues equal government spending. Now, we choose to increase government spending and we choose to increase taxes, lump sum taxes, by the same amount. We end up with a higher level of output and we still have a balanced budget. Right? That seems like pretty good policy. What do you think? Sound good? Maybe? Well, the reason that it looks so good is because we haven't spoken about any kind of change in prices. This would always be a short run effect, right? Because this is a change in aggregate demand, change government spending and taxes by the same amount. Yes, indeed, we can increase output, but it will be a short run thing. Because as soon as prices change, right, what happens? Wages start increasing and we end up back at full employment, but with a higher level of government spending and a higher level of taxes. Okay. So we've seen that the government spending has a multiplier. In other words, we increase government spending by some amount and output will increase by more. Or if we decrease taxes, we can decrease taxes and output will increase by some amount and it will increase by some amount more. So if we want to understand what that would look like in terms of our diagram, if we had an increase in government spending, increase in government expenditure, or a decrease in taxes will shift our aggregate demand. But due to the multiplier, the shift in aggregate demand, the increase in output will be greater than the change in government spending or the change in taxes. Yeah? Okay, so an expansionary fiscal policy shifts aggregate demand to the right. And it's not just that there's a change in government spending increases aggregate demand, it's that there's a change in government spending, which then kicks into gear the multiplier effect. And how does the multiplier effect work? Increase in government spending increases output. Increase in output increases income. Increase in income leads to increase in consumption expenditure. Increase in consumption expenditure leads to an increase in output. Increase in output leads to an increase in income. Increase in income leads to increase in consumption expenditure. Okay? So that's our multiplier effect. What about the fiscal stimulus and aggregate supply? Well, if you have a government stimulus package that promotes reduction in taxes and is not big on government spending, then what you're going to have is not only this demand side effect, but also a supply side effect. Okay? So in other words, a fiscal stimulus package that is heavy on tax cuts and light on government spending works but an increase in government spending alone is not as an effective way to stimulate production and create jobs. Why? Remember, if we increase government spending, it's fine in the short run, except prices will rise and we end up back at the long run, right, with higher prices. If, however, we also have tax cuts, and those tax cuts shift labor supply, right, and that shift in labor supply leads to an increase in output and leads to an increase in full employment output, then it's a useful kind of growth tool, right? In other words, what is our government spending using? What is our government spending being used on? If our government spend is just going to be used on things that go into consumption, right, then all we've got is a demand side effect. And a demand side effect will simply lead to inflation. What you really want, if you want to promote growth from the government side of things, is one of two things. Either cutting taxes that promotes production, right? Or there's another way you can do it, which the textbook doesn't really talk about, but it's this thing down here. What about if government invests in things like infrastructure? Increase government spending on infrastructure, which then promotes growth. Building electricity substations, building roads, right? Building dams. Those are the things that stimulate your economy. So yes, government spending can indeed be good for growth, as long as you're not spending it on stuff that is essentially just short-run spending, right? You need long-run spending or a tax policy that promotes supply-side production. Okay? Where were we? So as we've spoken about, there's not enough empirical evidence about the size of government spending and tax multipliers, so it's impossible for Parliament to determine what kind of stimulus we actually need, right? We need better data to know how to make better policy, and we don't have it available at this point in time. So again, if you're interested in economics and you want a career in economics and you're interested in these kinds of questions, there's plenty of work to be done to find out what we need, right? What is the current state of things? We don't know. So that's one problem. We need better data. Also, we don't even know what our actual full employment level of output is, right? We don't have a measure of that. We can estimate it, but our estimates are not particularly good. In other words, we don't actually know whether we have any kind of an output gap. Do we have an inflationary gap? Do we have a recessionary gap? Are we in fact at full employment? These are difficult things to measure, okay? And they can only be estimated with error. So again, you're interested in this stuff, want a career in this kind of stuff, plenty of questions to be answered. Another problem with trying to get your fiscal policy right is that there are time lags. In other words, the discretionary fiscal stimulus actions are hampered by time lags. What kind of time lags? Well, there's a recognition lag, a lawmaking lag, and an impact lag. So what do we mean by recognition lag? Okay, one, the recognition lag is the time it takes to figure out that fiscal policy actions are needed. So first you have to know that we have a problem before you can use your fiscal policy, right? Then, once you understand that there's a policy, it takes you time to say, right, we want to change our policy, okay? Which means we might need to change laws. We need to get member budgets and things approved by Parliament, for example, right? So there's a lawmaking lag. The lawmaking lag is the time it takes for Parliament to pass the laws needed to change taxes or spending. Unless you have a finance minister who doesn't care that much about Parliament or breaking the law and is prepared to spend money on things that are not approved through the appropriate mechanisms. That's also described as state capture. And then you have an impact lag. So not only do you need to know that there's a problem, then you need to get everyone to agree on what measures need to be done in order to address the problem. It then takes time after you've started addressing the problem for the problem actually to be addressed, right? So there's an impact lag. The impact lag is the time it takes from passing a tax or spending change to its actual effects on real GDP. So you could end up that you're in a recession, you need to increase government spending, but by the time you actually increase government spending, the recession's over, right? And now you're entering into a period of an inflationary gap, and now your government spending starts kicking in. Well, it's just going to make your inflationary gap even worse, right? So fiscal policy stuff can be dangerous. Okay? You could have good intentions and it just doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. And that's basically the end of our fiscal policy stuff. The way that we can address these lags, in other words, there is another kind of policy that we can use that doesn't have these kinds of lags, and that is monetary policy. Okay? And that's the next chapter. So, should we take a quick break? Well, before you agree to that too quickly, we've come to the end of the chapter, so we're going to do some examples. We can either take a break and then do some examples, or just do some examples and then leave early. You want to take a break first? Okay, take a break, cool, and then come back with these examples. Once we finish with these examples, then we finish for the day. Then it's monetary policy next week. If you've got any questions, just shout out and I can help you out.